Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're about to uncover an emotional new chapter filled with love, sacrifice, and hidden danger. After giving up everything, the CEO returns to Tieu Lac's peaceful hometown, believing they can finally start over. But what if the quiet village isn't the safe haven they hoped for? As mysterious strangers begin watching their every move, and an anonymous warning shakes Tieu Lac to her core, a terrifying question emerges. Has the CEO's mother already extended her reach into the one place they thought no one could find them? Stay with us until the very end to discover whether this peaceful countryside marks a fresh beginning or the start of an even more dangerous nightmare. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas packed with suspense and shocking twists, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next episode. The sunrise over the city felt strangely different that morning. For the first time in years, the CEO walked into his office without carrying a briefcase full of contracts. No stack of reports, no endless phone calls, no board meetings waiting for him. Only one small travel bag rested beside his feet. The decision had already been made. The previous night had changed everything. His mother's ultimatum still echoed in his mind. Choose the company, or choose Tieu Lac. There was no middle ground. He had spent hours thinking. Not as a CEO, not as the heir to a business empire, but as a husband, as a father, as a son. When the sun finally rose, his answer became clear. Before leaving the city, however, there was one place he had to visit: the hospital. The familiar hallway felt colder than ever. Doctors and nurses greeted him politely, yet every step toward his father's room felt heavier. He quietly pushed open the door. The chairman was still lying motionless on the hospital bed. Machines continued their steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. The CEO slowly walked closer. He gently held his father's hand. "Dad." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. I couldn't protect the company the way you wanted." He lowered his head for several seconds, then looked at his father again. "But I promise you one thing. I won't run away. I'll come back. Not because someone gives me your position, but because I'll earn it myself. I'll rebuild everything with my own hands. And when I return, I'll clear your name. I'll uncover every lie, and I'll bring this family back together." A single tear slowly rolled down his cheek. He gently adjusted the blanket covering his father, then quietly stood up. As he turned toward the door, the chairman's finger moved ever so slightly. Just once, almost impossible to notice. The CEO never saw it. Outside the room, the chief physician watched everything through the small window. He sighed quietly. "Please wake up soon," he whispered. Meanwhile, at the apartment, Tieu Lac had already packed their belongings. There wasn't much. A few suitcases, their daughter's favorite toys, several family photographs, simple clothes, nothing expensive, nothing luxurious. Looking around the apartment, she smiled softly. This place had witnessed countless memories: their daughter's first laugh, their first family dinner, their happiest moments, their hardest nights. She gently placed one last framed photo into a box. The little girl looked around curiously, completely unaware that today, their lives were changing once again. A few hours later, the CEO returned home. Tieu Lac immediately noticed the redness around his eyes. "You visited Dad?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "I made him a promise." She didn't ask what promise, she simply believed him. Together, they carried the final suitcase downstairs. The luxury apartment slowly disappeared behind them. This time, they weren't running away. They were choosing a new beginning. The drive lasted several hours. As skyscrapers slowly disappeared, wide green fields gradually replaced them. The air became fresher, the roads became narrower. Mountains appeared in the distance. Their daughter pressed her tiny hands against the car window, laughing excitedly every time she saw cows, chickens, or rice fields. The CEO couldn't help smiling. He suddenly realized his daughter had never truly experienced this kind of life. No expensive playgrounds, no private gardens, just nature, fresh air, freedom. For the first time in weeks, his heart finally relaxed. Late that afternoon, they arrived at Tieu Lac's hometown. Nothing had changed. The small dirt roads, the familiar bamboo trees, the peaceful river flowing beside the village. Several neighbors immediately recognized Tieu Lac. "Tieu Lac, you're back!" Smiles quickly spread through the village. An elderly woman hurried over. "Oh my! Your daughter has grown so much." Tieu Lac laughed happily. "It's been a long time." The CEO quietly stood beside her, watching everyone greet Tieu Lac with genuine warmth. No one cared who he was. No one called him CEO. No one bowed respectfully. To them, he was simply Tieu Lac's husband. Strangely, that felt comforting. As they walked toward Tieu Lac's old house, her mother rushed outside. The moment she saw them, tears instantly filled her eyes. "My child." She hugged Tieu Lac tightly, then gently held her granddaughter. Finally, she turned toward the CEO. Without saying a word, she simply nodded. The CEO immediately understood. She had already forgiven everything. That evening, the small family gathered around a simple wooden table. Home-cooked dishes filled every corner, boiled vegetables, braised fish, fresh soup, rice harvested from the nearby fields. Nothing expensive, yet somehow, everything tasted warmer than any luxurious meal he'd ever eaten. During dinner, everyone laughed, shared stories, remembered old memories. Even the CEO found himself laughing naturally, something he hadn't done in months. After dinner, he quietly walked outside alone. The countryside was unbelievably peaceful. Crickets sang in the darkness. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. Countless stars filled the sky. Tieu Lac slowly joined him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He smiled. "I finally understand what real peace feels like." She gently leaned against his shoulder. "We can stay here as long as we need. No one will find us." The CEO looked toward the quiet village. For a brief moment, he almost believed her. But deep inside, he knew things could never be that simple. At that exact moment, hundreds of kilometers away, inside the company's headquarters, the CEO's mother stood silently before the enormous window in her office. A private investigator handed her a sealed envelope. "They've left the city," he reported. She slowly opened the file. Several photographs fell onto the desk. The CEO, Tieu Lac, their daughter, walking through the countryside together. She stared at the pictures for a long time, then quietly smiled. "So, you really chose her?" She closed the folder, then calmly gave her next instruction. "Keep watching them. I want to know everyone they meet, everywhere they go. And if necessary, help them understand that peace never lasts forever." Far away, the CEO looked up at the peaceful night sky, unaware that even here, in the quiet village he believed would become his family's safe haven, someone had already begun following every step they took. That night, the countryside was wrapped in complete silence. No traffic, no ringing phones, no endless meetings. Only the sound of insects hidden among the rice fields and the cool breeze drifting through the bamboo trees. For the first time in months, the CEO slept without setting an alarm. When the first rays of sunlight entered the small bedroom, he slowly opened his eyes. For a brief moment, he forgot everything: the company, the board, his mother's ultimatum, his father's hospital bed. Everything seemed far away. Then he heard laughter outside, bright, pure, his daughter's laughter. He walked into the yard. The little girl was chasing chickens with Tieu Lac's mother. Every time a chicken flapped its wings, she burst into uncontrollable laughter. The CEO couldn't help smiling. Tieu Lac walked over carrying 2 cups of tea. "Good morning," she said softly. He accepted the cup. "I haven't had a morning like this in years." She smiled. "Then maybe it's time to slow down." He looked across the endless green rice fields. For the first time, he wondered if happiness had always been this simple. After breakfast, the CEO insisted on helping around the house. He repaired an old wooden fence, cleaned the yard, even learned how to feed the chickens. Several villagers passing by couldn't help laughing. "So this is the famous son-in-law from the city." The CEO laughed with them. "I still have a lot to learn." There were no expensive suits anymore, no polished leather shoes, only a simple shirt stained with dirt. Yet strangely, he had never felt more alive. Over the following days, life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning, he accompanied Tieu Lac to the local market. He carried vegetables, helped elderly neighbors transport heavy baskets, played with the children in the village. Slowly, people stopped seeing him as an outsider. To everyone, he became simply Tieu Lac's husband. One afternoon, an elderly farmer approached him. "You've got strong hands," he said with a smile. The CEO laughed awkwardly. "I wasn't born for farming." The old man shook his head. "No, but a man willing to work beside his family will never truly be poor." Those simple words stayed with the CEO long after the conversation ended. That evening, he sat alone outside the house, holding a notebook. For the first time since leaving the company, he began writing. Business ideas, investment plans, potential partnerships, small projects that could be started without relying on his family's wealth. He remembered the promise he had made beside his father's hospital bed. "I'll return by my own strength." If he truly meant those words, he had to begin now, from nothing. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, the chief physician continued investigating secretly. The missing surveillance footage still bothered him. The resigned nurse had disappeared without a trace. Every clue seemed to end abruptly. Yet one detail refused to leave his mind: the medication deliveries. Someone still had access to the chairman's room. Someone was continuing the plan. He quietly copied every medical record onto a secure drive. "If something happens to me," he whispered, "someone must know the truth." Back in the countryside, the CEO's peaceful days did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, a black luxury sedan slowly entered the village. Its appearance immediately attracted everyone's attention. Children stopped playing. Farmers looked up from the fields. Nobody in the village owned such an expensive car. The vehicle stopped several hundred meters away from Tieu Lac's house. A man wearing sunglasses stepped out. He looked around carefully, then took several photographs. The house, the yard, the CEO, even the little girl playing nearby. Before anyone could approach him, he quietly drove away. The villagers exchanged confused glances. Who was that? No one had an answer. Later that evening, an old neighbor mentioned the incident during dinner. "We saw a strange car today," he said. "They seemed to be looking for someone." The CEO's smile slowly faded. He looked toward Tieu Lac. She immediately understood what he was thinking. "They found us," she whispered. Neither of them slept well that night. Early the next morning, the CEO quietly walked around the property. He carefully examined the road leading into the village. Fresh tire tracks remained clearly visible in the dirt. Someone had definitely been there. As he stood silently, an elderly villager approached him. "I've lived here for over 70 years, the old man said. "I've never seen a car like that." The CEO nodded politely. "Thank you." The old man hesitated, then added one more sentence. "Sometimes, the danger isn't the people who arrive. It's the people already waiting." The CEO frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man simply smiled. "I hope I'm wrong." Then he slowly walked away. Those mysterious words lingered in the CEO's mind. That afternoon, Tieu Lac received an unexpected phone call. The number was unfamiliar. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" Several seconds passed. No one spoke. Then, a woman's voice quietly whispered, "If you truly love him, leave before it's too late." The line immediately disconnected. Tieu Lac stood frozen. She tried calling back. The number no longer existed. When the CEO returned home, she told him everything. His expression instantly changed. He looked toward the distant road leading out of the village. His instincts told him one thing. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone wasn't merely watching them anymore. Someone wanted them afraid. That same night, inside her luxurious office, the CEO's mother calmly reviewed another report. The investigator placed several new photographs on her desk. The CEO repairing fences, playing with his daughter, walking beside Tieu Lac through the rice fields. She stared at each photo in silence, then smiled coldly. "So, you really believe happiness can protect you?" She gently closed the file. "My son, you still don't understand. You can leave the company. You can leave the city, but you can never escape the consequences of choosing Tieu Lac." Far away, the CEO stood outside beneath the star-filled sky. One hand held his sleeping daughter, the other held Tieu Lac's. He had finally found peace, or at least, he wanted to believe he had. But deep within his heart, he knew the battle had only changed its battlefield. The corporate boardroom had disappeared. Now, the quiet countryside itself was becoming the next stage of a far more dangerous game. And this time, the enemy was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was already watching, waiting, for the perfect moment to destroy the fragile happiness they had fought so hard to rebuild. After sacrificing his position and leaving the company behind, the CEO returns with Tieu Lac and their daughter to her peaceful hometown, hoping to begin a new life. Before leaving the city, he promises his unconscious father that he will one day return through his own hard work and expose the truth behind the conspiracy. Surrounded by loving neighbors and a simple countryside lifestyle, the family finally experiences genuine happiness. However, their peace is short-lived when a mysterious luxury car appears in the village, secretly photographing their every move. Soon after, Tieu Lac receives an anonymous phone call warning her to leave before it's too late. Realizing someone is still watching them, the CEO understands that escaping the city was only the beginning. As danger quietly closes in, can he protect Tieu Lac and their daughter while preparing to reclaim everything he has lost?